Is the world failing Yemen? It's 8 years since a revolution sparked hopes for change. Instead, years of war and the world's worst humanitarian crisis followed. So, what hopes are there for peace? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Millions of Yemenis saw an opportunity for change in 2011. Protesters inspired by the Arab Spring demanded the resignation of President Ali Abdullah Saleh. He eventually relinquished power after 3 decades, but hopes of democracy soon faded. 4 years of civil war have led to what the United Nations calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with famine, disease and suffering widespread. On the 8th anniversary of Yemen's revolution, Priyanka Gupta reports.
These graves of protesters killed in Taiz are a reminder of a time when Yemen got a brief glimpse of hope. February 2011, the city's Freedom Square, the birthplace of Yemen's Arab Spring. It was an important moment for the people of Yemen. From the streets of Aden to the squares of Sana'a, thousands of men and women rose up against the 33-year rule of President Ali Abdullah Saleh. A call for political and economic reforms morphed into rage against his government after peaceful protests faced a violent crackdown. In the end, Saleh was forced to resign. In Taiz, protesters have gathered again in Freedom Square to mark the 8th anniversary of the uprising. Activists like 28-year-old Ruba Jaffer are hoping to keep the revolution alive.
Revolution is like a flame. Once sparked in a man's heart, it cannot be smothered. Our revolution has not been perverted. It rather came to a standstill halfway through. Had the Yemeni revolution completed its course, we'd have achieved what we aspire to.
Instead, Yemen is now in the middle of a war, and Taiz is under assault from different armed groups. After Saleh's resignation, Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi took over. A process of reconciliation began, but that was short-lived. In 2014, Houthi rebels stormed into Sana'a from their stronghold in the north. A Saudi UAE coalition began a military campaign in support of the Yemeni government led by Hadi. Saleh, the man protesters deposed, first aligned with the Houthis and then was killed by them in 2017. Thousands of Yemenis have been killed in the war, many of them children. The conflict has pushed the region's poorest country to the brink of famine. 20 million people don't have enough food to eat. But some activists say the revolution gave Yemenis something bigger, the idea of democracy.
We will uproot all the corrupt or those plotting to undermine the achievements we made. We believe the revolution is still moving forward. We believe in its principles, ending family succession in the rule, toppling the corrupt dictatorship of 3 decades.
A political and diplomatic solution to the war in Yemen seems uncertain. A UN-brokered ceasefire agreement has not brought peace to Hodeidah. The port city is a crucial gateway for much-needed humanitarian aid. Priyanka Gupta for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our panel now. Joining us on the phone from Sana'a is Hakim Almasmari. He's a political and military mediator. In Amman, we have Karl Schembri. He's a regional media advisor in the Middle East at the Norwegian Refugee Council. And in Washington, D.C. is Sama Al-Hamdani, a visiting fellow at Georgetown University. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Masmari, we've spoken so many times over the past 8 years. What happened to the Yemeni revolution? Ali Abdullah Saleh was removed, but why wasn't he replaced by democracy?
That was the plan. Democracy was the plan. Even the revolution was called a peaceful revolution, and the place where hundreds of thousands of protesters gathered was called Change Square. They were seeking change. They were seeking democracy. They were seeking a better future. That, sadly, was not the case. In 2013, President Saleh, ex-President Saleh, he rejoined his power, and he started ensuring that the revolution failed in taking it personal. By 2014, he opened an alliance with the Houthis, and by that time, the Houthi controlled Sana'a and the revolution came to an end. The entire government was a victim of a military coup. And sadly, after the Houthi so-called revolution on September of 2014, as of now, until now, we have tens of thousands of civilians who have been killed. And Yemen has been living a 4-year war because of the Houthi revolution that what they say is a continuation of the February 11 revolution. But that's not the case for many, many thousands and millions of Yemenis who are now living in exile, living under poverty.
And it is because of those thousands and, in fact, millions of Yemenis who are suffering in various ways that Yemen is, of course, called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Mr. Schembri, I know that you've been in and out of Yemen over the past few years. We call it the world's worst humanitarian crisis, but what does that look like when you are in Yemen? What is life like for people there?
Well, it's massive. I've just returned from there, and it affects Yemen across the board, all sectors, from professionals who haven't received salaries for the last almost 2 years now, to people who are extremely malnourished, children on the brink of death, to displaced families who have been hit more than once, ending up in the line of fire, their houses destroyed. They move, they flee, and they get in the line of fire again. The fighting reaches them, and they're forced to be displaced again. Absolute poverty that is now reigning supreme across the country. I've seen doctors who haven't been paid their salaries and they still go on with their jobs. They're saving lives. Teachers, professionals. The Yemeni economy has been brought down to its knees. It's not that food isn't available, but it's that it is so expensive. It's inaccessible for the ordinary Yemenis out there that they can't afford to eat it. I've met a little girl, aged 10, who has been displaced 4 times over the last 4 years, and was telling me last week how they go at night hungry, not having eaten at all. Like every other day, they have to eat their meals every other day because they can't afford any more than that. So it's really hard to give the full picture, except that this is just deteriorating. It's a country that has been through cholera, on the brink of famine, massive poverty, and mass displacement of people all the time.
And despite that scale of suffering, it's also called, one of the world's forgotten crises. Ms. Hamdani, why is that?
Why is it one of the most forgotten crises in the world? Well, for many reasons. First of all, there is no international interest to kind of listen to the voices of the Yemenis on the ground just because of how unpowerful they are. Mm-hmm. Again, like they mentioned before, Yemenis are not wealthy, they're not powerful. And then on top of it, the Yemeni political elite at the moment are taking one side or the other in this conflict, which is making things difficult for the average Yemeni on the ground who's paying the price for this. The average person is starving while the political parties are competing for power on the top levels. And of course, this war is some people would say it's not the forgotten war. Some would say that it's the unknown war. Of course, the Khashoggi assassination has changed all of that and brought a lot of media attention on Yemen. However, we have to remember that powerful countries that could stop this conflict are in fact the countries supplying the weapons to this war and are part of the, there are countries that are now taking sides in the Iranian-Saudi proxy war, and it's not becoming about Yemenis. It's becoming about regional hegemony, while the average Yemeni citizen who's poor, who's starving, is the one paying the price. And ultimately, we have to remember that we're not getting a lot of footage from the ground, and it's been really difficult to cover this war in a regular way with competing crises happening across the Middle East. And so it makes it very difficult for the average Yemeni citizen to have a voice or a say in what's happening.
Mr. Almasmari, as Ms. Hamdani noted, Yemen is, of course, one of the poorest countries in the region, and it is being bombed by some of the richest, the Saudi Emirati coalition. And again, as pointed out by Ms. Hamdani, they are being armed by, superpowers, the United States, the UK, France. But what impact would you say that the Saudi Emirati coalition entering the war on the side of the Yemeni government has had on the war?
forget about when the Saudi and UAE were involved in the war back in 2015, the changes that happened until now. I was in Sweden in December for the peace talks. I just arrived in Yemen a couple of days ago. In the last 2 months, the difference that I saw in poverty is unbearable. Families are in the streets begging. Entire families of 6 or 7 or 8 can't find breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And this is not only hundreds of thousands, there are millions of families. And as your guest said, it's not a problem of having aid. There is no money. Salaries have not been paid for over 2 years now. Inflation of prices have increased 300% over the last year and a half. The currency has collapsed over 200% in the last 9 months alone.
And to what extent has that suffering been exacerbated by the fact that this is not a war that involves only Yemenis? We have the Saudi Emirati coalition supporting the Yemeni government. We have Iran supporting the Houthis. So how much has that international involvement really made things so much worse and prolonged the war?
Oh, for sure. It made it impossible to solve the war only through years of negotiations. Before, it was a Yemen issue where sides could meet and get together. And as Jamal bin Umar, the UN envoy, said back in 2015, sides were almost close to signing a political deal until this war happened by the Saudi coalition. So there was hope, but now there's so many powers involved in the Yemeni war, so many sides that are stuck in the Yemeni war, so many sides that are gaining political interest, financial interest from this Yemeni war. It's now very impossible to end this war, and that's why even the negotiations, as I said in Sweden, after they signed the deal, that it will take months to implement the resolve, and not weeks, as the UN thought it would be, because there's so many international sides involved in this war, and it's not only one side that you're dealing with. Unlike the Houthis, which are one side, and it's easier to deal with them because they have one leadership.
Yeah.
And that's not the case when it comes to opposition.
Well, despite, all of those divisions and so much despair, we did have some good news. As you're mentioning, there was that ceasefire agreement for the crucial port city of Hodeidah that was signed in Sweden. Mr. Schembri, is that ceasefire agreement holding?
Well, we, as a humanitarian agency, we don't monitor the actual fighting. What we can say is that there is artillery fire going on almost on a daily basis in Hodeidah. I could hear it last week at night. The air raids seem to have stopped inside Hodeidah city, but there is fighting elsewhere that is raging on, and people are still being displaced, and they are still coming in the line of fire. So it's a very specific agreement that has so far stalled. It seems to have stalled the front lines from developing further inside Hodeidah. But the areas around Hodeidah city, outside the port area, are extremely fragile. It's an extremely active war zone. Parts of them are inaccessible to my colleagues who need to get aid to the people. And I would add another point also to the pertinent point made earlier about the coalition and the countries that have an influence on this war. As humanitarian agency, we call on the top donors, actually. Mm-hmm. They happen to be the top donors of the Yemen response. That is the United States, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and further down, the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. We want to see an end of the duplicity, of the hypocrisy of, with one hand, feeding, keeping Yemenis alive, and at the same time destroying their country. Yemenis need much more than aid. They need an end to this. They need the lifting of the blockade, and they need all ports and airports open so that they can resume with their lives.
And that takes us to the point that Ms. Hamdani was making earlier, which is that these superpowers that are giving aid to Yemen, yes, but they're also arming, the Saudi Emirati coalition, who are complicit in the killing of civilians. So, you have various countries saying that they want the war to end, but you have many of the same countries continuing to arm the warring parties. So can any, UN efforts to end the war be successful while superpowers continue to arm the warring parties?
I believe that is very possible because Yemenis are armed to the teeth. And not just that, the Saudi Emirati coalition have had all the weapons and all the support that they can get. And it feels that all the sides are exhausted from fighting. And of course, that's not to say that one side is more dangerous than the other. Of course, when we saw what's happening in Yemen, we see that they're all exercising some form of criminality. And to touch base on what the previous speakers said before, Yemenis don't just deserve the end of the war, they deserve much more than that. If we are going to talk about the Arab Spring and the uprisings in Yemen, what the people of Yemen had demanded was, you know, it looks at such a high bar compared to what their demands are today. For instance, then they wanted dignity and they wanted freedom and they wanted a democratic practice, and that was quickly hijacked by political parties. But today, the demands of the Yemeni people is to have access to food, electricity, and the demands have changed drastically. And to kind of touch note on the Arab Spring anniversary, it's important to note that who started the revolution were the youth and independent women. And of course, the youth today are the weakest faction that you barely hear voices coming out from the youth. A lot of them have been absorbed by political parties or feel like they have to ally themselves with some political entity in order to have a say of some sort. And that's really tragic. And when it comes to women, of course, women were such an important component of the Arab Spring. They took to the streets. They were alongside men. And then today, when you look at the Yemeni government, there's barely any female representation in the government. And of course, the role of women on the ground has become very militant, which is very unfortunate. And then all peace efforts that have to do with women are organized independently. And so that's very tragic when it comes to that. And then, of course, both sides on the ground are detaining independent voices, whether they're youth and women. And just most recently, we have Miss Awfa al-Naami and Miss Asmahan al-Umaisi have been detained by the Houthis, and we don't know why and how long they will be detained. And we know that Miss Asma was sentenced to death. And of course, on the other side, similar practices are happening. And it's all not building towards confidence in the peace process. It's just showing that Yemen is sinking further and further into a darker place.
Mr. Almasmari, you know, Ms. Hamdani is making some very good points, talking about the people of Yemen, the youth, the women, which we don't actually talk about enough because we're constantly talking about the Houthis and the Saudi Emirati coalition and the Yemeni government. And when it comes to the Yemeni government and the people, do the people of Yemen see President Hadi as their leader? He's the internationally recognized leader. But if we get to the point where, you know, the fighting comes down and we can have negotiations about peace, is he the person to represent the youth, the women, the people of Yemen?
Over the last 4 years, the majority of President Hadi's stay has been in Riyadh and not in Yemen. I think that answers the question, is if Yemeni people believe he is their president. He honestly cannot come to Yemen, and if he does come, he's under the security apparatus of the UAE-run security. So he has no authority in South Yemen. He has no authority in North Yemen, where the Houthis are now in control. Very, very few, only those who are benefiting from President Hadi are the ones who feel that he is still president, and that's because they are gaining from him. But the tens of millions in Yemen have not seen anything and do not even consider him as president, mainly because, as your guest said, they don't care about who's the president or not right now. They want food. They're dying from hunger. They want humanitarian aid. They want medical attention. They want the siege to come to an end. They want to live and survive. So we've reached a phase that no one cares if the president is alive or not, because their life is on the line. Their safety is on the line. And right now, it's the worst it has ever been when it comes to freedom of rights and democracy. Tens of thousands of prisoners are in prison all over the country, whether in the north and the south. Newspapers have been closed. NGOs have been blocked and closed and taken over by those who are in control of the Sana'a. It's tragic what's happening right now in all of Yemen. So President Hadi is not an issue, and very, very few consider him as president of Yemen.
And Mr. Schembri, I'm sure you'll agree with what Mr. Almasmari was saying, that, President Hadi is not the issue here. It is the situation for Yemenis.
Absolutely. I mean, the practically every Yemeni I talked to over the last 2 weeks was telling me that they all want to get back to their normal lives. They love their country. They want to get back to their jobs. They want not to need to to beg for aid. They've been reduced to aid dependency from the ambitions of the Arab Spring to to starvation and being on the brink of famine for so long. So of course they're pleading for the world leaders and the sides to the conflict to take a step back, allow them to go back to their normal lives. They've lost so much, relatives, friends, houses, assets, jobs, and it's now how long can they go on with this? We keep saying in the humanitarian world, Yemen is on the brink of famine. Yemen is just on the brink, and we think it can't get worse, and it does. And it does, and this is what is now a really prolonged crisis that needs immediate ending.
And Ms. Hamdani, what do you think it will take everyone involved to actually hear the pleas of the Yemeni people that Mr. Schembri is talking about? I mean, you speak of a fatigue by all sides, but the war continues.
The war continues simply because there's a war economy. And so the easiest way to dismantle this war is to stop the flow of income that goes to benefit this war, whether it's through smuggling or financing political parties from outside parties, or whether it is, the weapons economy of itself. And so the minute you dismantle that and you start funding the processes of peace, the business is going to shift from war to peace.
So how do you dismantle that?
How
do you dismantle that, and who does it?
Unfortunately, while we talk about this war being a Yemen conflict in origin, it's now become a regional conflict, and nothing can happen without the say or will of international actors. And so once they put their foot down very seriously on this war, then we'll see a difference. So the say has to kind of come from a top-down approach, from the regional actors saying this is enough, this is what we would like to see, and we're just going to begin phase 2. Of course, we've seen a lot of times that when the regional actors are prepared for this, we have the Houthis on the ground who would go ahead and ruin the peace processes. But that's just the way that it's going to have to be. You're going to have to sign a peace treaty, and you're going to have to you're going to have to sacrifice the fact that political parties are not getting exactly what they want. Because there are always going to be spoilers, but you have to just go ahead and do it because Yemenis are suffering. And of course, we've talked about the looming humanitarian crisis for many, many years, and everything that we predicted to happen has happened, and you still see very little reaction to that, and almost like it's a political strategy to kind of just make Yemenis suffer towards the end, and to assume that that's some sort of victory would be incorrect. And so, like I said earlier, it takes international actors to kind of put their foot down and to say, hey, we're not going to support different parties in this conflict just because we have interests at the stake. We're just going to support peace from now on, and we're going to make friends with everyone.
Mr. Almasmari, are we at that point yet where international actors are going to say that they're no longer supporting this war?
It's not now. It will never happen. Yemen was already the worst humanitarian crisis in 100 years last year. So imagine how it is right now. Millions of more families added to that list of poverty. Do we have hope? Yes, the UN is moving, but though it's moving in baby steps, there has been complications, and that's why we're trying to move this political talks and create a core Yemeni group of mediators who can also be involved in these peace talks and try to solve these problems within, instead of counting on international figures, international allies, and trying to solve this problem at a regional or international issue. As long as this problem is not Yemeni solved with international support, it will be impossible to be solved. International support needs to be there, but not as sides who are influential in the peace talks, but sides who are aiding and helping the war come to an end. That's not the case today.
Mr. Almasmari, thank you as always for your time. We do appreciate it. I want to thank all of our guests. That was Hakim Almasmari joining us on the phone from Sana'a. We also have Karl Schembri, he's in Amman, and Sama Al-Hamdani in Washington, D.C. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.